Hello, I'm Zach, aka Zach the Mystic. This is my lecture on God. This is the first of what I hope is a 7-part series of lectures called Unlicensed Psychology. I have no license, and I'm not sure a license would do me any good given the kind of stuff I'm interested in. I have an audience here, which I would like to thank for showing up and helping me to create this lecture. I want to start by saying this is my first lecture. I don't know how to lecture. And often when you don't know how to do something, you have to get creative. I picked, therefore, for this first lecture, the subject God. Now, most people would not pick the subject God off the bat because either they wouldn't feel competent to talk about it or they don't care enough about it to talk about it. But I fall into neither of those categories. I care a lot about God. I may not care a lot about the same kind of God that most people care about, but it's of tremendous interest to me. And I'm also the kind of person who believes that you don't need to have a degree in order to talk about God, or almost any subject. One is capable of discussing. It's possible for a person, through their own experience, to develop a competency and a capacity which sometimes resembles expertise, which leads one to wonder whether any degree in anything is genuinely the reason one becomes competent in the thing. I will start by reading a few sentences. Let's say that God is the underpinning to all that is and all that we do. We are all here in this room, but you don't know what's happening, and I don't know what's going to happen. But we're here anyway. So you could say that God has willed that we are here. Thank you. You may say that you came here of your own free will, thus separating your will from the will of God. You have an independent will. And that's true up to a point, but there are many factors which caused this event to happen. It may have happened much differently, and insofar as it's happening this way, at this moment, it can be considered the will of God. But then when you say, what is the will of God, what do you mean? To say anything is a will, what is a will? What is something's will? A will is an idea of what ought to occur based on the facts at hand. But it's hard to know when somebody says the will of God, how much consideration God has actually given to making the things as they are. Not knowing to what extent God has actually thought about what is happening is the source of tremendous intellectual and moral challenges. Because God could very well have given no consideration at all to how things are. At which point saying anything is the will of God is pointless. But it is an essential component of our human nature to make value judgments. At any given moment, we are full of them. Regarding what's occurring, what will occur, what has occurred. Now, if a bad thing happens to a person, and we can find no fault in the person to whom it happened, it strikes us as morally wrong. There's something wrong with this. It's as if a lightning bolt kills your best friend. This is bad. It feels horrible, and we're not robots. We cannot respond to such an event without emotion. So we seek causes for things. We want to know why things occur. It seems that we are very rare or unique among life forms, and that we seek causality in everything which happens, especially important things. We have storytelling brains which seem to piece together events which serve to pacify our need to understand the causes of things, even things from which from other perspectives have no causes at all. If a friend is killed by a lightning bolt, from a purely scientific perspective, there's no reason why that friend should have died. The only reason would be that the lightning hit where that person was at that time. So this would be the atheistic perspective, and it sees no inner reason and finds no cause for what happens. But I argue that the atheistic perspective can only be taken so far. Much more common is our human instinct, which starts to deduce causes and formulate a story as to why any given person has suffered a horrible tragedy. Our instinct wants to place blame on something. We want to know why it happened, and there are two main places we could accuse. One is the person, and the other would be something outside of the person. If there are no obvious faults to the person's behavior, that doesn't necessarily prevent people from blaming the person anyway, because they often will generate the story which says, well, they did something wrong. There's a hidden secret. They're sinful underneath. I don't see it, but it's still their fault. This is a very convenient solution for anyone who believes that God is good and morally right and God can't do anything bad, because it allows them to bear witness to any act of horror whatsoever and still maintain that God is good and right and just. Because they can say that whatever happened to the person was their fault. They were harboring some secret sin, and that's why God would choose to kill them, or whatever God did to them. And these kind of accusations are actually very effective in primitive, I would call non-modern cultures, because if people have an instinct for loving the king, and they think that if the king goes and kills somebody, they don't want to blame the king. There's a strong instinct against blaming kings, and the kings can use these kind of things to maintain power structures. And so you can have a hierarchy of legitimacy where everybody's in this hierarchy and it does something wrong, but people are some people. And the hierarchy can use the idea that it's something like God, that it's something like something innocent that's incapable of doing the wrong thing, to perpetuate its power. But let's assume that you're not obsessed with how good kings are and how good established structures are. Let's assume that you are a little bit more morally sophisticated than to automatically blame the person to whom unfortunate things have happened. Since everything which happens in the universe can be thought of as the will of God, the only explanation for why the person was struck is that it was God's will. And this raises the question, what kind of God is it who kills people for no reason? And I think that that's the real crisis with God. It's often called, it can be called the problem of evil, but the real question is, how can we live with a God that is mean, to put it bluntly? I would also argue that Christians and other monotheists kind of reject the idea that God is mean. They don't seem to be able to live with a God that is capable of reckless cruelty, indiscriminate cruelty. And then the question is, well, why is that? Why are so many of the people who talk about God unable to think of God as someone capable of evil, something capable of evil acts? And I believe that from observation that there's actually, it's kind of like a mental health issue. There are enormous mental health benefits to believing in the traditional God, a power in the universe greater than oneself which knows what it's doing and has good intentions. I also believe that it's impossible for a modern thinking person to conclude that such a God exists. This is the real problem. If you ask what God is on the basis of scientific evidence, you get maybe a few traces of directed and intentional thought, but far more blindness, randomness, and chaos. And I'm sure people could argue with this. This is what I see. But nobody likes this version of God. For a lot of people, the whole reason to imagine a God in the first place is because he, she, or it is good and loving. God, for many people, is supposed to counteract precisely the randomness and chaos the universe would appear to have been created from. But we lose science when we do that. It's hard to imagine, if you are an objective scientist, there's no way to see God that way. So this is often a very personal issue. Many people struggle enormously with wondering why they're here. And if I didn't struggle with wondering why I'm here so often, these issues would not be on my mind. I would find something less controversial to spend my time thinking about. So I'm just going to read this paragraph, like, straight up. I'm not sure. Sorry. Sometimes I think it would be better for me not to have ever discovered the universe at all. Wouldn't it have been better to just be happily like an animal without having to be aware of the insanity with which our universe was created and by which it runs? For many people, the awareness of this craziness leads only to suffering. It seems that our human species has been created with the capacity for awareness, for the awareness of things, and yet we struggle desperately because many of us lack the capacity to enjoy the things we are aware of. There seems to be a huge biological component to our ability to enjoy things. Things which would enhance our Darwinistic fitness we seem to enjoy. Sex, having and raising children, the prosperity of whatever tribe, family, or race we belong to. It is therefore easy to conclude that the person to whom the most biological fitness and fortune has been granted in the way of physical attractiveness, tribal power, children, and natural talents will be the happiest person. That people are genetically built simply to be happy at things which promote their own genetics at the expense of whatever competition is fighting for the same resources. Powerful as the biological component of happiness is, it is still possible for people to wonder, is this all there is? Is there any more than this? And what are the people who are not in the process of reproducing going to do? Are they supposed to wallow in misery because their instincts are being thwarted by nature and whatever led to their circumstances? I've seen many people who think that they're not under the powerful sway of biology, but from my perspective, they're simply unconscious of its influence. I'm not talking about people who are unconscious of biology here. I'm talking about people who are fully conscious of the powerful forces of biology at play within themselves, who still ask these questions. In our society, the actual act of reproducing, of producing a new living baby, is still seen from the point of view of a sort of religious awe, which is why so many people have such problems with abortions, because they don't fully understand the whole nature of human existence and reproduction. Implicit in the anti-abortion stance is that we human beings are here for a reason, that there is some knowing, all-powerful, and usually loving creator who has made the universe for a reason. And many religious people are actually quite good at raising their babies. If you believe people are supposed to continue reproducing, that God has put us here for precisely that reason, and this God is all loving, all powerful, and knows what it is doing, this is a very successful formula for continuing what appears to be biology's purpose. But what if you actually want the truth? I'm trying. That's the controversial part of the lecture, is that what if your goal is to find the truth? And what bothers me is that we live in a world where the only truth is the false truth, right? Like, that there seems to me to be a truth that doesn't care at all about whether you survive or reproduce. I'm constantly wondering whether there isn't some way to be aware of the truth while still participating fully and happily according to the biological powers which drive us, or whether the people who know the truth will always have to be relegated to a shunned minority whose knowledge proves too much of an inconvenience to the people who are happily and blindly reproducing and going about their business without any real need to know about underlying reality. It seems like the good, loving, all-knowing, and all-powerful God is completely incompatible with the God who actually seems to have been responsible for this world. Chaotic, amoral, unfocused. I'd like to give an example in that we understand ourselves to be orbiting a star which has a finite lifetime, and we look out and we see incredible distances until other stars, and very little evidence that the stars nearby us are like us, that they are also harboring life. It's as if life is actually the enemy of the universe, and we're only able to exist in the smallest little area. And I don't like it, but it's true. So, excuse me. How could I get to this perspective? I was thinking maybe I'm some kind of angel who fell just a little bit too far from heaven to be able to like swallow the idea that God knows what He's doing completely, and I'm still I have a different view of God. I'm able to have a relationship with God, or whatever spiritual powers I'm talking about, despite my unwillingness to accept him or it as an all-loving and all-knowing. There is an old saying which runs, the fear of God is the beginning of wisdom. Whoever said this understands that God is not all-loving. The idea of the fear of God, God-fearing persons, etc., shows that there is another definition of God which credits him with a terrifying aspect. Most of the Bible itself actually accords with this idea. The loving part of God is introduced mostly in the New Testament and is not very convincing from my perspective. What I want is a God who is worthy of both love and fear. That makes the most sense to me. I can have a relationship with that type of God without insulting my brain. For example, I don't know why I am alone so often in the way I think. If God is all loving, then I can only blame my suffering on myself for some sin I don't know about. But if God is also to be feared, then I can live not in shame, but with a robust vigor about life, as if facing a storm, capable of choosing my own destiny instead of going to paranoid lengths to look inward to figure out what it was I did wrong to have God treat me like this. I can know that not only my own flaws, but God's as well, are something to fear. Unfortunately, at this time, I don't know anyone else with my beliefs. My condition is the one in which I believe that I have opened two gates, the one which leads to the religious way of thinking and the other which leads to the scientific way of thinking. Under many circumstances, the person who has opened two such gates might be thought to be flooded with people who are interested in the bridge between the two worlds. But my conclusion is that many people are what in the traditional religious terms is great sinners. And so you can imagine the opposite of why there's not that much interest in this topic is because the people who have religion are perfectly happy not knowing anything about science, and the people who have science generally don't care about religion. People seem to prefer ignorance, generally speaking, which I can attribute to the instincts, which tend to learn only as much as is necessary for the immediate future and then stop. And the thing is, I also fit into this pattern, except for whatever reason, my immediate future has demanded that I dive into both religion and science. In other words, I'm just trying to explain myself with this paragraph. This is where my first essay stopped. I wrote a couple other essays in the. I'm sorry. Excuse me. I want to give a couple quotes from various places on account of the fact that I want to say that historically the God that I'm seeking is actually more common than people think. I'm just going to read this page. I don't know why I am here in this universe. Suffering goes hand in hand with the religious question of why the sufferer exists. When you're not suffering, you're in the moment. And when you're in the moment, you don't need to ask the big questions. But I am often not in the moment. I very often wonder what I am here for. People who ask this question often find in God, quote-unquote God, some kind of solution. So I ask, how viable is the solution that they're finding in God? Are such people necessarily deluding themselves? Is it morally wrong to delude yourself, even if doing the opposite feels really bad? Facing reality in its cold harshness is hard, but not facing reality is evil. Or is it? How evil is it to accept a world view which does not accord with observable reality? If believing God is good prevents you from killing yourself, that, I suppose, is an acceptable reason to believe it, especially if you're not particularly harmful to anyone else. I want to get to God, but I want to get there in a way which doesn't make me seem evil to myself. People who declare God good and eternally perfect are essentially saying that anyone to whom something bad happens deserves it in some way or other, since God is perfect and would never do such a thing. That makes them seem evil to me. That makes those people seem evil to me. But which means abandoning the idea that God is exclusively good. Is there a God which can simultaneously be capable of evil and appealing to the people of our modern times? Hearing people say God is good gets old quick, but the opposite, not having any God at all, puts so much responsibility on the person to figure out his own reasons for being here and his own actions that it's like a fire too hot to bear. The God who is not good seems so evil and so scary that I wonder how anybody could form an organization such as a church whose purpose it was to worship such a God. Is religion therefore not possible for someone morally sophisticated enough to see that God is the original source of evil? Perhaps it takes a kind of very strong person to take this darker, more all-encompassing God seriously. I seek the people who are capable of doing this. Will they ever be great enough in number to form churches, congregations, gatherings of their own? Or is it a kind of God to be discovered only by people in their darkest moments, with no possibility of ever appealing to a mass audience? Those are rhetorical questions. I'm just asking them. I don't know the answer. I want to say that I like movies such as Star Wars Because Star Wars, with regard to the Force, if you imagine the Force as God, it goes beyond the capacity of popular monotheisms in acknowledging that there is a dark side to God. This corresponds actually with some very old religions and also some parts of the Bible, which are of little interest to people who think God is good. The first one I wanted to quote, I found in Joseph Campbell's book, The Hero with a Thousand Faces. And he says, a folktale told by the Basambwa of East Africa. This is a picture of God that I am interested in. Of a man whose dead father appeared to him, driving the cattle of death. Or there is a folktale of a man whose dead father appeared to him, driving the cattle of death, and conducted him along a path that went into the ground, as into a vast burrow. They came to an extensive area where there were some people. The father hid the son and went off to sleep. The great chief, Death, appeared the next morning. One side of him was beautiful, but the other side was rotten. Maggots were dropping to the ground. His attendants were gathering the maggots. The attendants washed the sores, and when they had finished, Death said, "The one born today, if he goes trading, he will be robbed. The woman who conceives today, she will die with a child conceived. The man who cultivates today, his crops have perished. The one who is to go into the jungle has been eaten by the lion." Death thus pronounced the universal curse and returned to rest. But the following morning when he appeared, his attendants washed and perfumed the beautiful side, massaging it with oil. When they had finished, Death produced the blessing. "The one born today, may he become wealthy. May the woman who conceives today give birth to a child who will live to be old. The one born today, let him go into the market. May he strike good bargains. May he trade with the blind. The man who is to enter the jungle, may he kill game. May he discover even elephants. Because today I pronounce the benediction." And then the father said to the son, "If you had arrived today, many things would have come into your possession. But now it is clear that poverty has been ordained for you. Tomorrow you had better go." And the son returned to his home. I get excited about stories like that. One side of the face with maggots and another side very beautiful. To me, that is a God for the future. That's a God that I can live with. That's it. So before I turn off the camera, I want to have as much interaction as my wonderful audience is capable of producing with me. If there are any questions or comments, now is a good time to ask them.
So what do you think about the people, like religions, that do really fear God and see God as like a terrible God as well as a benevolent God? Like, isn't that, like, how is that not in line with your beliefs? Because when you're talking about it, I'm like, well, I know several people who think that God is like evil and good.
What bothers me is when I go to a church congregation, or I don't go to church that often, but when I've gone to churches, what I love about churches is how powerful and successful they are as institutions, and how many people use these institutions to raise their families, and they have a lot of powerful things which go on at their institutions. And obviously a frustrating thing is that it's based on a lie, or it's based on a partial truth or a half-truth. And I don't know that many people who have a religion which says, maybe you could say the Zen Buddhists are pretty good at that, and a lot of the Eastern religions are much more comfortable with God having a dark side. But that leads to the question, how did the monotheisms become so powerful? Why? And we live in a civilization which is based on monotheism, so I have to live in such a civilization. I don't. If I got to live in a situation where they were more accustomed to having a more dynamic God with, which spanned the whole spectrum of moods and attitudes, and I probably wouldn't feel as bad about the situation, because I don't think that the monotheisms are not there for a reason. Like, I suspect there's a reason why these monotheisms, which declare God to be good and perfect and everything, got as far as they did. And our culture is definitely distinct from the Eastern cultures. And I don't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater. I want to take the good stuff that we have and leave the bad stuff. Because I just haven't met like very many people who belong to. I'm jealous of those churches. I love the good mood and the singing, and they do so many like admirable things at the churches. So that's the source of my real frustration. I have no real fundamental problem with people who actually adhere to this other religion, but what I want to know is, could you actually have good institutions based on that too? And I don't know that many people. Like if you're a Taoist, you have yin and yang, and that's clearly a symbolism which has a lightness and a darkness. And Star Wars is kind of like that. Star Wars is kind of like a Taoist movie. Do you want more questions?
I think more what I was asking was like, so there are religions that are like I'm thinking like evangelical Christians, like that they do promote like fear of God. They're like, God is scary, also wonderful, very scary. So they promote both. And so I'm wondering like and that seems to be kind of what you're going for, but like what's different about that than what you're saying?
There's a problem with the contradiction. I think this is it's like a Santa Claus problem. It's like you tell people that Santa Claus exists, and I guess that's good enough for them. But if you're talking about the fear of God, if you're talking about evangelical churches who are talking about the fear of God, then they have to go against one of the traditions of their church, which is that God is loving and has a plan and knows what he's doing.
But I think that's what I'm saying, is that not all churches have that as a fundamental belief. Like a lot of them have
I'm really interested in those churches. I'm really interested in how you could get those to work. I don't know too many of them. I don't know too many of them. And I know that a lot of Protestant churches adhere to the God is good and loving. And I mean, I'd be interested in going to those churches and seeing what they believe and how do they structure it. How do they build it so that it works and it doesn't fall into a really horrendous thing like Waco, Texas, or something like that. That's one of the things that obviously appears is questions of like, well, if you what they call sail too close to the wind, if you dive too far into it, do you end up with David Koresh and something like that? So I love that subject matter. It's like how can you get the good stuff without succumbing to the overwhelming power of the mythologies and the psychologies that are involved with terrifying gods. Is that as good? That's as good as I know how to do with that question. I'm not sure what I'm interested in the subject matter. I'm not sure I know. Maybe I don't have sufficient familiarity with fire and brimstone preaching. And that's what's so funny about fire and brimstone preaching is like, if God is good and somebody's standing up preaching fire and brimstone, there's only like one real conclusion, which is that God isn't good. Like God is capable of things. And one of the things these churches do is they always go to the mythology of that, well, there's some secret inner sin that either you don't know about or I don't know about. That's the reason this is happening to you. And if you read the book of Job, you can see a perfect example of that. It's like a great story about Job has things happen to me, and it literally says without cause. Like, the Bible is saying flat out that these things are happening to Job without cause. And so I don't know. I haven't met the Christians who can actually embrace that sentence, who are capable of embracing the idea that these things are happening without cause. I've never met those Christians. The ones that I met have always fallen back on well, I might not be able to see what you're doing wrong, but you're obviously doing something wrong because God wouldn't be doing this, you know. It's just inadequate. It's very not good enough. We need the world needs something better than that. Thank you for asking a question. Thank you, camera. You've been a wonderful participant in this conversation. You're so attentive, and you're just the kind of audience member that I love to have. Of course, you don't say anything, which is why I love real people, too. Okay, I think that is all for Lecture 1, Episode 1, as it were. Since life is, all life is a stage. See you later.